All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and get started with our Education and Culture Committee work session today. We're going to be meeting with our Montgomery County Public Schools to talk about our capital improvements program, our CIP amendments based on our enrollment projections. I know that we have Dr. Zuckerman with us, who's going to be joining us, as well as Ms. McGuire. It's always great to see you guys can come on down. Mr. Song, as well as Ms. Karamias and Mr. Schmidt. And I will turn it over to Mr. Levchenko, who's going to walk us through this first part of the briefing, and then we'll be working with Dr. Orland when it comes to our public schools adequacy test immediately afterwards. So, Mr. Levchenko, why don't you go ahead and walk us through the packet today?
Yeah, sure. As you mentioned, we have this divided into two parts. This first part, we will get a briefing from MCPS and their consultant on their new enrollment methodology. And then after that, we will actually have a briefing on the actual enrollment projections themselves and a summary of that going forward. Obviously, enrollment projections are a key input to the entire CIP and operating budget for the schools. So it is an important issue for the committee to be comfortable with today, understand where and how these numbers came from, and we'll also hear, obviously, in the second part, how they influence the subdivision staging policy schools test. And to the degree there are issues with that, we'll be taking those up later as we discuss the amendments, as well as any possible solution projects that might affect the SSP. So we have all of that we're going to try to sort of tee up today, but we'll be talking in detail about all of the projects at a future committee meeting. So with that, I'll turn it over to the schools folks for the enrollment methodology briefing.
Thank you, Mr. Rice, and good to see you again today. Thank you for being with us yesterday to fight for more school funding. We really appreciate that in Annapolis. Thank you.
Dr. Zuckerman, just for the record, could you introduce yourself? Sorry.
I'm sorry, yes. My name's Andrew Zuckerman. I'm Chief Operating Officer for Montgomery County Public Schools. I have Dan Schmidt, our consultant from MGT Consulting to my right, Essie McGuire, our Executive Director for Operations, Adrian Karamihas, our Director of Capital Planning, and Mr. James Song, our Director of Facilities Management. So thank you for having us today. We were going to start actually with Adrian showing the updated enrollment projections, but we realized with all of the interest in our methodology that the elephant on the table is the methodology, so we should probably start with that. So we're going to dive into that, if that's okay with the committee, Mr. Levchenko. So we changed our approach to enrollment forecasting, as everyone knows. We used to rely on what's called a cohort survival model, which is a single approach, and we moved to a multivariable approach to enrollment forecasting. And the best way that I can explain the multivariable approach is related to how we all study the weather forecast that comes in when in advance of a snowstorm. And I know my colleagues on PTA sent me a letter today saying that looking at the weather is an oversimplification of this, but I actually think it's a really helpful way for everyone to understand what we're talking about. So I spend a lot of time in the winter months in my role looking at weather forecasts about whether or not to open or close schools, and I'm always praying that it's not going to snow. And fortunately, well, let me knock on wood about going forward, because we have used our snow days up. But everywhere I read the North American, the NAM model, there's the Canadian model, there's the European model, the American model, and every model of snow that's coming in is predicting something slightly different. When a forecaster is looking at these four models, they're making a prediction based on all of them, and they're using their skilled expertise, their experience, their analysis, and applying that to what they're seeing to make an informed prediction about the future. A couple weeks ago, we had snow that was predicted for Monday morning. Channel 9 was calling for 3 to 6, and Channel 7 was calling for 2 to 4, and in the end, we got rain. At the end of the day, until the event actually occurs, we won't know the full efficacy of the analysis, and we stipulate that. But at the same time, a weather forecaster wouldn't rely on just the Canadian model every single time to predict the weather. And that's what we were doing with the cohort survival approach. The multivariable approach is much more robust. But again, it's a prediction. And just like with Channel 9 and Channel 7, there's going to be differences in what those analysts are looking at. And I think at the end of the day right now, in the back and forth that I've had certainly with my colleagues on PTA, we have a difference. And I actually think that's healthy. I think that's good. I think that's good public discourse. At the end of the day, just like when we're planning for the weather, we have to be ready for what's going to happen on Monday, from Sunday to Monday. And so that's what our CIP is. We're ready. Whether it was 3 to 6 inches, whether it's 2 to 4, the plows are out, the roads have been salted, and we're ready to go. And that's where we are right now with our CIP in terms of the order of magnitude, in terms of the difference from our perspective. And so I think it's just helpful to understand as we're looking at this, how we move from a single approach, a single model, to a multivariable approach. And I think Dan Schmidt can give a lot more in-depth analysis to it, but I wanted to just share with you how a perspective that we're bringing to that. So I'll turn it over to Dan.
Thank you. Again, Dan Schmidt with MGT Consulting Group. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm going to jump right into the agenda here and just speak for a moment about the overview and national perspective. I really like the way that Dr. Zuckerman set up this idea of models and the way that you put things together, and the weather's a very useful explanation for that, because an example of that, in our house, if the forecast calls for 2 to 4, we assume nothing. It's just sort of how it works with folks back in the Midwest. It's unpredictable and driven by a lot of different factors. Here it's the same thing. And there's a lot of conversation about whether a model is right or wrong. I prefer to think of it whether a model is useful. Is it useful for the kinds of decisions that you need to make? And whether it's related to snowplows and the weather that's coming, or capital construction and the enrollment that might be coming, the question is, how useful is that model? Lots of different ways to do it. We have a methodology that uses 4 different sub-models that get a weighted average. I'm going to walk through each one of those sub-models with you in a moment. A weighted average that produces a single projection moving forward. This is a methodology that we have found to be useful in districts across the country for more than 20 years. And those districts have used this methodology to make capital investment decisions totaling in the billions of dollars. So is it useful? It has proven itself to be so in places across the country, in districts large and small, dynamic and stagnant, rural and urban. What does it look like? I'm going to get into the methodologies, how we've built things over the last couple of years, working with folks from County Planning Department, how it functions and interacts with the CIP, and then some examples on what those projections look like. First, talking about the sub-models, 4 of them. I'll describe the way that the model itself works, what data we pull for those models. Each one has a lot of data that underlies it, and so talk about how that factors in. The average percentage increase, or really better stated, average percentage growth model, looks at the change in enrollment from one year to the next for a particular grade. So we're not looking from grade to grade, like first grade to second grade. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is looking from 2010 to 2011. What was the change in enrollment for first grade? And then same with first grade, now 2011 to 2012, 2012, 2013, and so on. It's the growth or decline in enrollment for a particular grade, for a single grade from year to year. Okay, this helps to capture immigration coming from outside the district, could be international, could be domestic, but people just moving into the district and bringing children along with them. The students per household model, this is one that uses housing counts from the district and then identifies the number of students per housing type that would be generated. Sort of seems like an unloving way to talk about kids when you talk about generation rates, but that's what we do in this part of the business. How many students are generated per type of housing? Now, I'll tell you, when we started working with Montgomery County Public Schools 2 years ago and started getting into this review of projection methodologies, there is a component of the work that's happening in Montgomery County that we were pretty excited about. most districts that we go to, when we are working with a students per housing model, we are dealing with county data starting with 2010, when we had census workers walking around knocking on doors and counting up the number of households, striking a line 2010, which is pretty remote now, being that the census is coming again next year. 2010, how many kids were in each grade in 2010, comparing that against the number of households. Now we have a student generation rate that, as you can see, now would be 9 years old. We would then, in other situations, look at the number of housing permits that have been issued and try to divide those up as much as we can based on how the data is kept by the county. Assume some rate of growth of permits over the projection period, 10 years, and make an assumption that those turn into a housing unit that has a family that has kids. Okay? We didn't have to do it that way here. Because of the work that Glenn and Jason and the other folks at the County Planning Department have been doing to understand student generation rates from different types of housing, we were able to get much more granular and much more specific about dynamics here in Montgomery County for this particular model. So what we have done when we put together the projection forecast model is 4 different types of housing: single-family detached, single-family attached, low, medium rise, multifamily, high-rise multifamily. The county gives us the total number using 2016 data. I'll come back to the year in a moment. And then a student generation rate for each grade for each one of those 4 types of housing. Particularly in a place as dynamic in growth as Montgomery County, that sort of granularity is a real boon to being able to produce a useful enrollment forecast. Far removed from what other places would have us work with and try to massage in order to make it work to get a useful model put together. So it's a real benefit to the work that they have done, and credit for this process. I say we use 2016 data because that was the last bucket of data that the County Planning Department was comfortable giving to us to be able to put into the models for the last enrollment forecast that was done a year ago. Now that's been a year, so 2016 feels a lot further away, a year longer than it was when we did it. Next iteration, the next production of the forecast will have more recent data, and that it's a revolving thing. The data is always looking back. It's never in the moment that you're sitting in, regardless of what kind of data you're looking for. So that's why we use that 2016 data. We also then applied a growth factor, assuming from 2016 additional housing units coming online. Again, 2016 was a number, a total number for each one of those housing unit types. And we assumed that there would be a 1% increase in the number of housing units per each type over the next 10 years. Data that became available and was shared with us after we finished our enrollment forecast will help us to further refine that the next time around and to be able to understand the growth in the number of housing units in each cluster. Turns out countywide it was 1% between 2014 and 2018, so 1% wound up being pretty good, useful, even more useful next time around when we're able to get into specific clusters. And it's just a matter of continually chasing better data to be more useful as the models are progressing. It's an exciting part of what the next set of enrollment forecasts will be able to do with that particular model. Linear regression model, this one is a fairly familiar model, and that's a matter of finding the line of best fit through the historical data and then allowing the slope of that line of best fit to forecast out over the 10-year forecast period. Straightforward, that should sound familiar from your high school days. Finally, the cohort survival model, probably the most common model across the country, the one that we run into the most where districts are doing their own enrollment forecasting, and when we review competitors' reports, this is the one that pops up the most as well. Cohort, think of that as the group of students. This is looking at what percentage of students, the group of students, move from first to second grade, and then second to third, and third to fourth. So if you have 100 students in first grade in year 1, and you have 105 in second grade in year 2, then that is a 105% cohort survival rate. We calculate that for each year of the historical period, looking back 10 years because we're forecasting 10 years. The average cohort survival rate, whether it's an increase or a decrease, then becomes the forecasting factor for the 10 years looking out. Okay. The other piece that this model lets us do, actually insists that we do, we got to find a way to feed into kindergarten enrollment. We could do a linear regression line of best fit based on historical kindergarten enrollment. We have done that in some places if the data isn't otherwise helpful. The preferred way is to look at live birth data. We want to know, looking back 15 years, not 10, 15 years, what are the number of live births each year? Now, why 15? Because a child born 15 years ago became a kindergarten student 10 years ago. Or at least we want to know what percentage of those live births became kindergarten students 10 years ago, because now we have a capture rate. So if there were, easy math, 1,000 live births 15 years ago, and there are 500 kindergarten students, and we know we have a 50% capture rate. We can apply that capture rate against a forecasted live birth trend to say, okay, based on linear regression, line of best fit, this is what we think future births will look like. Now 50% of those will wind up being kindergarten students. And I'm just using 50% as an example for presentation purposes. But that gives us the starting point for our kindergarten enrollment, and then the historical cohort survival, one grade to the next, year over year, becomes the factor moving forward as that cohort moves through the district. Those are the four base models that we use to put together our enrollment forecast. Four examples of what those charts might look like, and you can see they're varied, right? They're a little bit all over the place in terms of how the math underlying those sets out a trend and a forecast over the next 10 years. This is where a matter of professional judgment comes in, because now we look at these models and we take into account what we know about historical trends for this particular school or cluster, or for the district, for the community, and ask ourselves which one of these models appears to be the driver for enrollment into the future. Okay? That's where the model weighting of these, I can't quite go there just yet, that's where the model weighting for these subgroups, submodels comes into play based on professional judgment and conversations with folks who know the community best. We have, over the last 2 years since we came on board, we're getting close to a 2-year anniversary. It was in May of 2017, where we came on board with Montgomery County Public Schools to review and analyze the previous enrollment methodology, work toward adopting this methodology, working with MCPS staff, working with City County Council staff, with the planning department staff to talk about how this enrollment comes together, where the data could come from, what the quality of that data is, and what does that data look like moving forward. Worked through all of the methodologies together, talked about what that means for calculations out into the future, and then really established some strong lines of communication for partnership moving forward. Again, I can't say enough of how amazing it is, the work that the planning department is doing of looking at the student generation rates, because it really does enhance the usefulness of our modeling when it comes to the students per household factors. I wish every district that we lived in, that we worked in, had the data available to get that kind of modeling. I hope I'm not laying that on too thick, but I really am happy with it. Really.
We appreciate your acknowledgement.
So what does this all mean for the CIP process? It enables us to do multiple polls for comparisons, spring and fall if so desired. Can give a longer running plan way if we do a spring enrollment update, so there's more time to anticipate where things will go in terms of an enrollment forecast, and more proactive earlier planning for the CIP. The data is all integrated with MCPS's data sets, their GIS software, the data that they're using to make capital improvement program decisions, and allows then for capital planning in the budget that winds up in the CIP. This is illustration of the historical enrollment from 2008-2009 school year up to 2017-2018. And I'm starting here to shift over into showing some specific schools, some specific things that happened with the enrollment. This was from a study that we did this was mostly in fall of 2017. Adrian's going to show the more recent results for the current CIP. This is historical enrollment to orient you. The elementary is at the bottom, the middle blue is middle school, and then the high school, the gray at the top. The number all the way across is total enrollment for the district. Here is showing that previous 10 years and then a 10-year forecast. Looking out to 2017-2018 school year, showing an overall increase, and then you can see what the variation is at each one of the grade bands along the way. As we get more specific, this is what these models look like when they initially get spit out. All right, that's a technical term. It's spit out. What we did here, you'll see the dates have changed a little bit. We went back to 1997. We looked at a decade of data there, compared it to the next decade of enrollment, and wanted to see how our methodology aligned with what actually happened. Okay? So you can see here the blue line with the circles, the darker blue line that starts on the left, continues all the way over to the right. That is historical enrollment, all of it up to 2016. The top lighter blue line is the students per household model. The light gray is the cohort survival, starting to get into the blending in there in the middle. Average percentage growth is the the orange with the circles, and then the yellow, with the circles is linear regression. The green with the circle sort of coming through the middle there is where we wound up applying our methodology to that 1997 to 2007 historical data and identifying a useful enrollment forecast for that next 10-year period. And to pull off those other models, you can see here what that actually looks like in comparison. All right, now it's not going to line up perfectly lockstep. Right? There's no way to do that. But it is in line, showing an increase over that period of time. Useful information in order to make decisions. Another example, different school. Again, historical enrollment going all the way through 1997 to 2008, and then the next 10 years. Here, our projection is actually shown in green, coming up through the middle. Linear regression showing more of a decrease here. The average percentage growth also showing more decrease. Students per household more on the increase up top. And so here with the weighting that would have been applied, I don't remember the exact weights for this particular modeling testing that was done. But when you pull that off, again, showing an overall increase, not quite as dramatic in the out years. And growth came a little bit more than what the model would have predicted here, but not wildly off. And so again, still useful in those early years in order to make decisions out in the out years. Moving forward a decade here, have a couple of slides here looking at what this enrollment forecasting methodology would do based on now the most recent 10 years of history, looking forward 10 years, and we've added in, you'll see in the black line here with the circles, that is the previous Montgomery County Public Schools projection. Okay, so here for Kingsview Middle School, you can see the linear regression model in that kind of darker gray going up top. The county housing data is across the bottom. We now have, at this point, had integrated the housing data coming from county planning. So we give it a different name here within the model. It's not students per household anymore, just for purposes of record keeping here. But now it's called county housing data. The light blue, cohort survival, showing a dip and then a little bit of an increase. And then the darker blue, the average percentage growth model up toward the top. Our forecast coming in at the red across the middle, showing a little bit of a dip in the shorter term, little bit of a dip there toward the end, maybe leveling off in that historical enrollment, but some factors in the out years that would suggest that things were going to go up, particularly with the county housing data pushing that model up. So when the weightings come into that and we see that county housing data model driving up like that, we have a degree of confidence that the linear regression model really isn't representative of what's going to happen out there, that we need to be taking that up further. If we pull the models off and just look at our projection as opposed to the previous MCPS projection, two different stories, one showing a decrease, the other one showing an overall increase, albeit a little bit of a dip in the middle. We factored in more pieces of information, not just cohort survival, but applying the housing data, applying two more models, linear regression and average percentage growth, that are allowing for immigration influences to affect that forecast to provide something more useful in putting together that forecast over the next 10 years. Another example, this one at Quince Orchard High School. The colors keep changing here, but the orange down the middle is our forecast for this particular modeling. The red going up the top is the average percentage growth. Linear regression is in the purple. The lighter blue, students per household. Here, everything pretty well showing an increase overall, and pretty tight too. So in this particular case, although that average percentage growth going up that high is probably an outer bound, that might be a little bit too high based on professional judgment and seeing what the other models are doing. But we find then the orange here being our forecast for Quince Orchard, again, at this point in time, actually tracked fairly well with the MCPS projection that was in place at the time. But you can see, again, how those models go up, they spread out, and then our knowledge of the trends behind each one of those data sets and understanding of what the implications are for the future allows us to find that forecast line in between all of those that best characterizes what would be coming in the future, and then that allows for decisions to be made from that. That brings me to the end of the slide presentation. Happy to answer any questions at this point, or we can roll into Adrian, whatever you'd like to do.
I think we'll have a couple of questions. Let me turn to my colleagues on the committee first. So, Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the presentation. Some exciting words you used there. Student generation, survival rates, capture, and spit out. This is exciting business that you're in. Very technical terms there. But no, thank you. This is helpful, and I know we're all very concerned about how to get this right. We all know the historical. When I was in MCPS in the 80s and 90s, we had a dip, and there was a little bit of we didn't plan for what was to come, and now we're in the situation where we're bursting from the seams, and so none of us want that to happen going forward, and obviously we've advanced what we're doing dramatically since then. And the presentation was very clear. I had a couple questions. You said a couple things that stuck out to me. You said useful but accurate, not necessarily accurate. You said you're more focused on useful. And what you've done across the country and here, what's the correlation between those two? How successful have you been in the places that you all have projected? How close are useful and accurate?
First of all, I appreciate your collection of the terms there.
No problem.
Your glossary for next time.
Movie premiere advertising.
We have taken a look at some previous studies that we have done and identified an accuracy rate of in the neighborhood of 2% margin of error. So pretty tight.
Plus or minus?
Yes, plus or minus, within 2%. I speak in terms of, the way I phrased it was not whether the model is good or bad, but whether it's useful. And whether, there's always a question, how many more layers do you put onto a model? At what point do you get a point of diminishing returns? There are other modeling methodologies out there, right? There are other ways to do it. We have found this to be useful for our clients when they are making decisions. Right? There are. Well, I'll give you an example. There is a competitor, but one competitor, the way that they approach it, it's a cohort survival model. but it's an average for the medium or the expected, maybe is the phraseology, enrollment forecast, but then they take a standard deviation above and a standard deviation below, and that's their high and their low, and then they're left to professional judgment on which one of those to choose. Okay? It's another way to approach it. We don't do it that way because we don't think that that's useful. We think it's more useful to come to a single recommendation, a single forecast for making decisions. We've toyed around with some probabilistic-based dynamic modeling. I think there's a way to do that within even some of the submodels that we have here. But I'm not sure that that level of complexity adds any usefulness to it. We have consistently found with conversations like this, we sit down, we say, we think this is what the forecast is telling us, this is where we think the weights ought to be in order to best characterize where that future enrollment is going to be, and then we move forward based on that, and that's worked really well.
Thank you, that's helpful. And the human factor or the professional development category, I guess, or not professional judgment, sorry, not development. I've got another education term in my head. So you talk to me a little bit more about what goes into that and what are some of the factors, and specifically you also said allowing for immigration influences is a term you used. What are those? What are you looking at when, say, in an area like our area, which is very diverse and has a ton of immigration over the historical period, but also recently? What factors are you looking at? Is that in that professional judgment, or what are you using in that bucket generally, but then specifically about the immigration?
When I say immigration, I don't necessarily mean international. I more generally mean people coming into Montgomery County from outside of Montgomery County.
So you're not looking at international, and you're not factoring that in at all.
We're not trying to quantify how many people might be coming from Ethiopia. I mean, I know we have a strong Ethiopian presence in the Down County Consortium, so that's why it pops to mind.
Sure.
But we're not trying to quantify what that number
You
might
wouldn't take into factor what's going on at the immigration patterns historically over time. You don't look at that as a factor.
Well, I'm going to take a step to the side for a moment, because there's a second component that we've been working with MCPS to develop over the last 2 years. When we were initially brought on board, it was a two-pronged project. One was the enrollment review. The other was to develop a plan for how to anticipate facility decisions beyond the 6-year CIP. And it might be 10 years, might be 20, might be 30. It was really undefined out there. It was just more than 6 years. Mm-hmm. What we developed through that process was something we called a scenario planning framework, a growth management plan. And we've developed these scenarios that can be applied to any one of the clusters, and we're working through the cluster list now, to say, here are the 7 factors that drive enrollment in this cluster. If these 7 factors align in this way, then it would appear that this is going to be a high growth enrollment scenario, or a lower moderate enrollment growth, or no growth, or maybe it's declining. Those are the 4 categories. Those 7 factors, one of them is immigration. One of them is public policy, like decisions related to, say, the purple line. One of those is the economy, unemployment, the housing market. And I'm blanking on the 7th one at the moment. But in conversations with MCPS planners, with Montgomery County planners, with parents from communities, we then identify what the dynamics are with each one of those 7 factors. A lot of it anecdotal, but as much as we can based on quantifiable data, a lot of it pulled from census data. Specifically to the enrollment point, we can see what percentage of a cluster is foreign-born. We can see what percentage of the cluster, or how the age cohorts are moving within a cluster to see if it's getting older or younger. All of that helps us to look at that cluster and understand what the scenario might look like beyond the next 6 years. Now, it goes further down into eliminating some potential facility planning options based on the scenario that's assigned, but for purposes of this discussion, what that allows us to do is to understand more of those dynamics that are happening within that cluster. Now, how does that factor into the submodels? movement of people into a cluster or into the district would get captured within the linear regression model. It'd get captured within the average percentage growth model, and also the cohort survival, although that gets a boost due to the kindergarten enrollment.
So even though that's the longer-term growth management plan number, that does get baked in some way to some of those models that you're running?
Absolutely a connection, yes.
Great.
And the relationship between the two is not static, because that growth management plan is 6+, it's moving. And somewhere, and the enrollment forecast is 10 years, so it's still 4 years plus 6, right? And you move further out here, but you also advance your 10-year enrollment forecast as well. So there is an interrelationship and a connectedness to that.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Good, thank you.
Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you, Chairman Rice, for allowing me to join the committee today and ask a couple questions. Just wanted to piggyback quickly. I totally understand the concept of there not being a single model, an all-season model that would work well in all scenarios, and think the idea of having multiple models where we look at the data in different ways is the right approach. I think after watching the presentation, which was really helpful to me, I'm still unclear, though, of how the models interface. Councilmember Jawando mentioned it, but you said professional judgment and weighting are used, but it wasn't clear to me how, and, what is the interface between those four? The way that it was displayed on the chart, it looked like it was close to an average of the models in, several cases, but it just wasn't clear what factors are used, what is, how are we deciding which model is used? Are we using a combination? Are we averaging them? How does the weighting work? It wasn't very clear to me. If you could explain that, that'd be great.
So the weighting it's a weighted average of all 4 models. Now, it might be that one of those models gets taken to 0, but it's still a weighted average of all of those 4, okay? We look at the trends and the changes in enrollment that has happened in the last 10 years. We look at what that means for cohort survival going forward. As we can see, there might be a bubble coming through elementary school that's going to, in the next 10 years, hit middle school, maybe start to touch high school, so we want to see if that's reflected as it goes through. We look to see when it comes to, stay with the cohort survival model for a moment, we look at what's happening with regard to live births. If live births are going down, but kindergarten enrollment has been going up, we have an inverse relationship. We need to understand why and how we rectify that within that model. We would take a look at what the trends are with regard to the female childbearing age population. If that population is going down, then that would mean, along with a declining birth rate, then that would mean, well, that cohort survival model might be more predictive of future enrollment, because that decline in kindergarten age students will impact the overall enrollment trajectory for the district. Over 10 years, those kids are going to move pretty far through the district. If it is a case of housing models showing a significant increase, and if it's a part of the district where growth is significant, then that might get a little bit more weight, because that would be more predictive or more usefully representative of what's happening in that part of the district. If housing is fairly stagnant, I don't even want to say stable, because it could be stably increasing, but flat, the cohort survival model says this isn't really going to push because live births aren't going up, we don't have more female childbearing age moving in. There's another term for you to add to your list.
We're taking note, don't worry.
Yes. So there it might be that it's more about the average percentage increase or the linear regression showing more constancy or consistency from what has happened in the past over the next 10 years, assuming that that's how that model laid out. It really is a matter of laying over an understanding of what's happening within those models, what the data underneath is instructing us, and seeing how historical enrollment has reacted to that, to find that weighting that best characterizes what's happening in the future, or what can reasonably expected to happen in the future.
So there's a lot of art to this science, is what
There's a lot of art to the science.
basically
That's right.
saying. Okay, and this is hard. I mean, as Councilmember Jawando mentioned, I mean, I'm very familiar with this. Both my parents went to elementary schools in Montgomery County that closed, they're in the down county area, that there wasn't a need for them for 30 years. And now there's a desperate need in those areas in Chevy Chase and Bethesda. The community centers that I spent the most time growing up were former elementary schools. One was an elementary school and one was Leland, a middle school. And so I'm very familiar with how challenging this is. I was interested, just similar to that. I mean, that was largely not based on new development, but neighborhood turnover. And live births is, we've talked a lot about, but some of it is live births of a family that's about to grow, that moves into a neighborhood as it is growing. Unfortunately, with the cost of housing in Montgomery County, those decisions are made later for most people out of just affordability issues. Where is neighborhood turnover factored in? At what model? Because that is the biggest piece of this, of neighborhoods that actually are changing, and those are tough because it's not a school generation, it's usually it's a 30-year time horizon that most people are in their homes before they move, or longer in many cases, which is a good thing because it's a really great place to live in Montgomery County, but a challenge when it comes to having the school facilities to accommodate and being flexible enough to move along with those families.
Yeah, that turnover in age of neighborhoods it's one of those things that it's anecdotal until you realize it's happened, right? You kind of look around, Tom and Judy left, Bill and Susie are here now, there's more kids out on the block. This feels like it's happening. When we talk about household composition, was the seventh one on the factors, on the scenarios that I wasn't coming to mind. And when we have those scenario
I mean,
assignments.
size and age, is that when you say household composition?
It means
Size of the family and the age of the children in the family?
a couple of things.
Okay.
Not necessarily number of kids, because remember, those scenarios are asking what might happen in the future. So really what we're asking there is, what probability are we looking at that more kids will come? So household composition might mean the neighborhood's getting younger. It might also mean that this is a part of the district where we have a lot of families, multiple families living in one single-family house. This happens in parts and pockets of the district. Maybe we have multiple generations living in the same house. That, by its nature, doesn't get quantified per se until maybe the next census or the next community survey once a year. But when we're doing those scenario assignments, we're thinking about it somewhat anecdotally to anticipate what might be coming. The actual impact of that happening is something that you really will only know in hindsight. Look at that, this neighborhood has turned over, it is producing twice as many kids as it did before, and the average age based on new census data has gone down.
Got it. Okay, just quickly on the planning piece of this, because you talked about the information used from planning and it being from 2016 and what those interactions were. I had a little bit of a different understanding. I just wanted to clarify. Were you in the meeting with planning?
I've been with meetings with planning, I don't know about.
In talking about methodology and data?
Yes, I have been in some of them, I have not been in all of them.
Okay, and then, because my understanding was they provided more recent data than 2016, but then learned that it wasn't used after the fact. So I just wanted to get some clarity on that, because I could have misunderstood that.
Yeah, no, that is accurate, it's a matter of timing. When we got more recent data, we were so far down the road with putting together this set of enrollment projections that it was too late to add any more data in. That's what it came down to.
Yeah, I mean, our planning department, that's what they do really well, is data, and I would hope that as we move forward and we figure out how this is going to work, that planning be a really close partner in the data collection process, and that we make sure that we sync up the time that data is shared, because this is a huge asset that we have in the county. I think our planning department on the data collection and data analysis side is as good as anything in terms of data in the county. And, I'd hope that you'd work really closely with them, and we'd make sure that we're, the left hand's talking to the right hand, so to speak, and that we sync the timing to ensure that that's happening.
Well, and I don't mean to cast any aspersion by saying it came late. The county planning has been an incredible partner throughout all of this. At some point, this is the data we're using for this particular rollout, or a particular forecasting model. But I don't mean to suggest at all that there was a failure or anything like that. The timing just didn't work.
Sure, I just hope that we can, formalize timing to make sure that we're getting the most up-to-date data as possible when the decisions are being made, and that, that communication is happening beforehand on both sides to make sure that everybody is aware of what is needed and that we're using the most up-to-date data possible. Obviously, these are huge decisions. It's half our budget. It's the most indispensable resource that we have in the county, and so to make sure that we're using the most up-to-date data so that your models that you're using, the science part of the art that you clearly are doing, is as scientific as possible, I think would be great. So thank you.
Thank you. Let me turn to Council President Navarro. Council President Navarro, I'm certainly off my game today,
You're good. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this update. I'm trying to, so I remember when we were having, we started to experience this issue of the projections not being as accurate. There was so much conversation at the Board of Education about what was happening, and there was, all these discussions about these issues of neighborhood turnover, as well as, especially during the recession, or the advent of the recession, people coming from private schools. And then there was kind of like this unknown, like this question mark, which was alluded to a little bit, and vis-a-vis the issue of immigration, not just internationally, but also nationally, and the fact that, we do live in a region, it's very well documented that we live in a region where a lot of, there's a big impact vis-a-vis immigration. May be very different from other places in the country when they're trying to, implement these kind of methodologies. And I think for me, this has always been sort of that question mark, right? What have we learned regarding these patterns? Because it's not as if this just occurred. When you look at that slide on Circle 7, and you see that since 2000 to 2018, the Latino student population has doubled. Right? There are definitely, I think by now, plenty of data that shows that there are certain patterns that have not been captured, I guess, necessarily. And some of it has to do with what people have done through generations in this country, right? So families may have to adapt because affordability of housing is elusive. Or families might begin in areas like Langley Park and Long Branch, but then they find step-up housing in Germantown or in Gaithersburg. And so part of what I think, I hope we're working on is to better understand and be able to track all of those particular patterns, because I still don't see them, and this is conversations that we've even had with planning. I don't necessarily see those factored that with fidelity in many of the formulas or many of the particular calculations that exist, but yet we wonder. And then sometimes we talk about, residential units coming, in the pipeline, and these are condos that are very expensive. And so we should know that those families are not going to buy those condos necessarily, especially if they're just one bedroom. So what is exactly happening? In my opinion, I think at some point we do have to be very frank about our county's population, our student population generation, the generation, and how are we incorporating those factors of immigration, of low-income families. A system that has 56,000 students receiving farms, well, by now we should have some sense, or at least have done some work to figure out, right, where are they living? If we're talking about this issue of lack of affordable housing, but we have 56,000 students, families that are affected by poverty, they're living somewhere, right? So if they found affordable housing somewhere, right? But so how are we capturing all of that? To me, I think it's also part of the conversation of figuring out, who we are, because if not, we're kind of spinning our wheels and pretending that we're only taking into consideration behavior patterns of certain communities. And we will continue to be surprised at the fact that we're not able to, be in a ballpark, range when it comes to projecting student enrollment. I mean, there is no doubt that, even when I hear people say things like, we were not ready. Well, we can't be ready if we have not been able to anticipate whether it's a pattern of migration from unaccompanied minors coming to the county. I mean, who can be ready for that if you didn't know it was happening? Or a downturn in the economy where people then are coming from private schools. There's just a lot of factors. So I just wanted to kind of mention that because it always seems to be the white elephant in the room that we continue to dance around. This is very unique to Montgomery County. Now we have historical data that shows that this is the reality in Montgomery County. So what are we doing to really acknowledge that, take that into consideration? To me, it's still elusive. And then two, once we have all this data, how are we really using this in MCPS to target the funding and the programmatic supports to the student population? I mean, if you're looking at this page and you see that you've had, double the numbers of Latino students, wow, that is so significant. What are we doing to to respond to that extraordinary growth proportionately? Not around the edges, but proportionally. And so I know those are conversations about operating dollars and things like that, but all of this really speaks to that in a major way. So I just kind of want to throw that out there because, when I was serving on the Board of Education, we were talking about some of these unknowns. Then I came here and it was the recession and there were more unknowns. But the immigration pattern, that is something that we should by now know very well, and it should be absolutely incorporated in these models. Because we have the information. I mean, it's not like we're just finding out. So have we done any in-depth, studies of where are the children coming from, or, what has been some of the patterns that you have identified? Are those continuing to, they're sustainable? The farms rate, are they still in particular geographic areas of the county? Have you done any sort of projections regarding that? I mean, that's remained pretty stable. So is that something that has been taken into consideration?
So two pieces in response to that. Actually, maybe just one. The dynamics that you're talking about with immigration, different race populations, ethnic populations, there's two pieces to it. The first is with the scenario planning framework. When we are thinking about what's happening within those clusters, we're looking at census data, not just 2010, but the most recent annual update, and clipping that data to that cluster boundary. So we're not thinking about what's happening in Walter Johnson if we're focused on Down County Consortium. Right? We're able to clip to just that area. So we know based on looking at that, and those community surveys are estimates, but the Census Bureau estimates. But we have an idea of where what a racial distribution is in terms of residents. We know where concentrations of folks are living who are foreign-born. We also are looking at that from an unemployment perspective, from an income perspective, higher education, home value perspective, to get a feel on the quantitative side of what that cluster or the DCC look like for a scenario assignment perspective. We're also talking with planners both within MCPS and within the county who just know the vibe of the area. And again, we just spent some time talking about Down County Consortium, and so the Ethiopian influence there is top of my mind because of that. And I was surprised to learn, I think I remember this right, that the Silver Springs area and Down County Consortium more broadly has the I think I have this right, the highest concentration of Ethiopian population outside of Ethiopia, because the openness to immigration to that area. It is a sanctuary city, and so folks are drawn there, and there's also social networks and simple things like restaurants that are
You
already
said it was a
built in.
sanctuary city? I'm sorry, what did you say?
I am told sanctuary city.
Oh, no, we're not at sanctuary.
Okay. What has been described to me.
Which is interesting, because, I mean, again, I'm not trying to question who you've been talking to.
Sure.
But, when I hear that, planners have a very good pulse of the vibe of a particular area, yet we're still finding ourselves with not the accurate projections and the accurate data, then sometimes I question some of that, right? I mean, the fact that we have, yes, the largest concentration of, Ethiopians outside of, we know that, that's very well known. But I'm talking about things like also patterns of migration even throughout the county, right? We have mobility rates that we know our students face. And again, if we have been tracking that, we kind of have understood a pattern of not just immigration to the county, but also, movement throughout the different parts of the county, which really goes towards that whole notion of being able to quantify how many students may be coming next year, or how many, residential units may be coming, should we be using that for planning. So I appreciate what you're sharing. I just think, because I've been here for a while, that we still seem to be missing the mark, and in my opinion is because perhaps we don't have such a great, understanding of the pulse of many of the communities in our county that now are representing almost majorities, especially with student population. And we need to get to the bottom of that, in some ways. So, and again, maybe that's not so much in your particular report, and maybe it's more for MCPS. What other kinds of...
As you were talking, and I was actually thinking of the intersection between, for example, state construction dollars and Kerwin Commission, and the intersection of it because of just the overlap nature of facility programming and academic programming. And one of the things that we're striving to move towards is greater alignment between facility programming and academic programming. And so you're right, there are a lot of that conversation is framed around operating budget, where we're placing programs, services we're providing, allocation of resources, and one of the things that we're trying to do on the capital side is to make sure that we're aligning that to make, as we've talked with you before, about the dollars go farther. But I think that in the end, that work, we spend a lot of time disaggregating the data to understand where in different parts of our county are areas of greater need, and then how can we partner with others if we're going to put for example, a linkages a site in a new school, a school-based health center, academic supports. But I agree with you. It's work that needs to continue and go far.
But it goes beyond, right? And I appreciate that, but it goes beyond that. I guess what I'm trying to say is that at some point we have to acknowledge who we are here in Montgomery County, what our historical data has shown, what the immigration factor means in all of these kinds of decisions that we're making, all these formulas and laws that we're adapting to project, so that we don't have residents who are constantly surprised by the fact that we don't hit the mark when it comes to, projections, right? When there are neighbors that say, well, how come my school now has this growth in enrollment? Well, it's important to understand the patterns of movement within the county, as well as, again, who we are and the fact that there might be families that are sharing housing, and are we capturing that, right? The fact that, yes, if there's going to be a residential complex that's going to be built and it's just condos and it's just a one-bedroom, well, most likely you won't have a lot of children, but there are other places where you will find more children, and it turns out that we haven't had any residential development in those areas. So why is that? You see what I'm saying? Because many of the formulas that we have even in planning don't necessarily capture that. And therefore, we are back here trying to figure out why is it that we're not hitting the mark when it comes to our projections. So,
Right.
So that's all I'm saying, just, kind of moving forward. And I think this model is much more robust than the one that we have used in the past. But I think we still need to make sure that we're taking into consideration this other external
And
factor.
I would just add, if I can, I think back to a couple of years ago, when with unaccompanied minors, and I know you were a big part of just having those policy discussions and decisions here. we saw a wave and an increase, and then it
Tapered off.
flattened, right? And we're constantly asking ourselves we're constantly looking at particularly our mid-year enrollment. We're constantly monitoring what's happening, federal policy, state policy, for exactly your point. But I think you're right. It needs to be refined, and it needs to be embedded in not just MCPS, but the culture and fabric of just how we make decisions at the county. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so before I turn to Councilmember Reamer, and I'm not going to ask my questions until the end, just wanted to clarify, and the reason why, the term sanctuary city, and it's one in which oftentimes draws, in some instances, a negative connotation because folks have criticized sanctuary cities for doing things that are against the law. We here in Montgomery County, and the reason why we think we have such a great and diverse community, and why a lot of folks, especially immigrants, come here, is because we are so welcoming, and we're so inclusive, and because we're so diverse, and because we support all of our community members. And so it really is one where it's interesting because as we do see the level of strife and conflict in other countries, do know that that will result in folks coming here from those particular countries, understanding that Montgomery County is oftentimes that land of opportunity as they look to the United States. As a person who just came from Ethiopia, I know all too well about the immigration patterns there, and it really is about opportunity. And it speaks volumes about the level of opportunity that we have here. But it's something that I do believe in what Council President Navarro's message is that there are going to be those other additional factors that are built on beyond what you have in what I think is a great starting point for a methodology. I do think that there are some tweaks that certainly, and with you adding the additional data, is going to help tremendously in terms of making it even more accurate. But I do believe that because we are so unique in who we are and who we attract here to the county, that there will be some additional considerations that are outside of what you may see in some other jurisdictions that we may want to factor in when it comes to our overall decision making. So let me turn to Councilmember Reamer before I jump into some other questions and comments.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for this presentation, really appreciate it. To your analogies, first, I wanted to comment, as a politician, I think a lot about political polling, and it doesn't seem unlike the idea of taking multiple different polls and averaging them together to have a average of different projections. And that was what kind of drove the whole 538, perspective on predicting the elections, and it turned out that the average of pollings was quite accurate. How you interpreted those pollings, the polling data was up to, the user, but it was quite accurate. So in general, the idea of using multiple tools and averaging them seems to make sense. But what I did also hear from you is that it sounds like there is a lot of tinkering within individual projection sets. So I guess my first question is, what does that apply to? Is this for an individual school? Is it on a cluster basis? When do you kind of get under the hood and say, well, we need to take a sharper look at what the housing data might show or where the development was? When residents are looking at a projection, how are they to know whether you have done that kind of forward-looking adjustment or whether that hasn't occurred?
So a couple of things in response. With respect to the housing data, we'll start there. We have cluster level data that we then apply to each one of the cluster schools. So we're not getting down into school area for housing units.
Okay, so say that again. That's significant. I think a lot of people want to
Important, yes.
Pause on that. So you use cluster level housing data, and then you distribute it across all the schools in the cluster.
Within that cluster.
And I know there will be some schools immediately say, well, that's not accurate. That's going to be wrong. So,
Yep.
Point here of transparency. That's the methodology.
Right, that's right. When you talk about tinkering with the data,
I didn't mean tinkering with the data. I meant, well, what you described, if I understood you correctly, was that you have these models, but that they allow for you to weight them and maybe input different data the housing data you can input.
Now I understand where you're coming from, I think. We have that housing data, or we have live birth data, or we have historical enrollment data that form the basis of those submodels. So those 4 models. What we then do when we are looking at the weighting that best characterizes the future forecast, we're not tinkering with the assumptions or the base data that went
You're not
into
saying,
those
well, the
models.
purple line is coming in 3 years, therefore we're going to input data to reflect something there. You don't do that.
If I hear you saying, purple line's coming, so let's add another 1,000 units?
Yeah. No, okay, you don't do that.
We are assuming, again, from 2016, 1% growth each year in housing units that would capture that sort of an impact whenever that purple line comes on. Okay? So we're not ignoring growth in housing units. We're doing it based on 2016, the current model, then increasing that 1% year over year. I would add to that, though, another piece of the.
And does each cluster have its own 1% type number, or have you just concluded that 1% is the right number for all the clusters, or?
Well, there's 2 pieces to that.
Yeah.
The first is for the most recent set of enrollment projections, we assumed 1% across the county.
Okay.
Turns out, more information that we have received from planning, between, I think it was January of 2014 to September of 2018, growth in housing units across the county, 1.2%. So in that respect, that 1% was useful. Now, information data we got from county planning showed growth not just at each cluster level, but also each one of the 4 types of housing units at each cluster level. Now, that's data that, and this is all emerging, they're working on getting their pieces together. I'm not going to say I'm going to read it, they're doing a great job doing it. The next iteration, then, we will be able to not say 1% across the county, we'll be able to say 1.1% for Walter Johnson, or
Based on the housing type that's going to be.
based on the housing.
coming in.
We even go, we know that 2014 to 2018 was 1.1 or 1.2 for Walter Johnson.
You're going to look at the actual development pipeline, and you're going to understand the actual type of housing that's coming in, and then you're going to have projection rates that relate to that.
So there's an important distinction to draw there. The data number that we get, that strike in time, here's the number of housing units, is based on plan approval. Okay? So what we're not trying to do there is to forecast when something will come online. Okay?
Plan approval is, you mean preliminary plan approval? Is that what it is?
You go
Yeah.
up on the terminology.
Okay.
Okay.
So it's not,
Right. But I do just want to add, because this has been a criticism of our CIP for a long time, which is when do we cut off what gets captured within the 6-year CIP? That's actually what drove us to do 2 things. One was a recognition that, again, a single model was not as robust as a multi-model approach. 2, the concept of growth management plans that Dan referenced earlier emerged out of a desire for us to look beyond the 6-year CIP so that we are positioned as a school district 10 years, 15, and 20 years out, recognizing what's in the pipeline. That's the 7 factors that he talked about, and as Ms. Navarro talked about, recognizing what are the migration patterns, what's in the planning pipeline, what's the type of unit available, so that we're ready to respond, because our CIP is a CIP within 6 years, and so we cut it off when something is in plan. And we hear every year, I've been in MCPS, this is my 6th year, and for 6 straight years, I have heard and empathized with the testimony from parents and community members who say, but I see the crane, or not the crane, I see the plans going in. I've been to the planning meeting, but there's not plan approval yet. So we cap it before the planning department officially approves those plans. But we're taking a look beyond 6 years.
okay.
So the next set of projections will bring in different growth data, be more tailored by type of unit and for each cluster. that will allow that to be much more useful for that cluster. Doesn't mean the current projections aren't useful. This just tightens that piece up even more as more data is developed in order to support those.
And where are you in the process of getting to be able to use that more refined tool? Because I think I'm hearing from some, like, why can't you do the update now? Why do we have to wait?
And so some of that really speaks to the processes that we are all bound by in terms of the CIP, in terms of those cycles. Some of those cycles are set sort of in the law and what different pieces key off of. So while we're doing the work to build that into the next iteration of the cycle, I think the idea that we want a set of numbers in the CIP, and again, there are a number of processes key off of that. So that's sort of part of the timing that we're working with here is, again, what's sort of required by all these various processes that we're involved in. I think that all of us, Park and Planning and ourselves, are, again, working through how to get this information more refined. And as we get that information from Park and Planning, we will be able to feed it in, but we're always going to have those point-in-time aspects that we're required to produce, again, relative to that. So we're sort of looking at both sense. There's the when do we produce a number that, again, is part of a process, and how are we working on building our analysis, which we're always doing.
Thank you. Can you go to the slide that you showed with Summit Hill or Strawberry Knolls, sorry. Strawberry Hill, Summit Knolls. So this wasn't actually the most striking one. It was Rosemary, it was Rock Creek Forest. Rock Creek Knolls. I know, they got a lot of hills and knolls. Can you go to Rock Creek Forest, please?
Next one, I'm sorry.
Rock Creek Forest. So the delta there between,
Am I here?
No, Rock Creek
go to
Forest.
Rock Creek Forest.
Rock Creek, okay.
Elementary.
Rock Creek.
so the MGT is at 594, and the historical is at 703. So, you know, I have two reactions to that. None of the models, it looks like, captured what happened in reality, because I guess it was a perfect storm. You know, what happened, what was going on in the world around us, there was just a lot going on. And I'm sympathetic because I think it's impossible to capture the real world perfectly in a spreadsheet, and some people would like us to do that, and they're mad that we don't. But on the other hand, you know, that gap, that's like 5 classrooms at a school. So what do you do here? This doesn't seem, this may be the best that can be done, I don't know, but it doesn't seem as useful as you've characterized it.
I do want to point out one thing, which is that when we're looking at that last year, in this model, that's 10 years out. So keep in mind that for the CIP, we look at 6 years. And that one of the aspects that we're getting with this model is that 10-year stretch, but that always is going to be more divergent as it goes farther along. So that's a 10-year difference. So keep in mind also that it's going to be rolling as we go through. So each year, the data will be upgraded and more accurate. And so the same way that we wouldn't say, oh, that's
You might have made adjustments along the way.
Exactly. This is a point in time, and again, we're getting that longer 10-year look because we want that level of analysis, but we also need to be cognizant of the fact that variations are going to be more broad the farther out that it goes. So we're all used to looking at 6-year tables, and so I did want to highlight that these tables are all 10 years. If you dial back to the 6, we're in much closer territory.
All right, that wraps it up for me. I think, again, this thing about why you couldn't update now, it sounds like you are really working on something important, refining this tool so that it has correlation to housing type, and that seems...
Well, I think what Essie's saying just with the update is we will be incorporating the new data when we do this for our next CIP, but we are where we are at this point in time, and we feel very well positioned for where we're happening. We'll make adjustments because we do this. It's an iterative process. I mean, it's that we get more data, and then we'll use it, and then that data will be out of date, and we'll use the next data. So I don't think the cycle ever stops, and the refinement is built into that iterative process. So I think that's just where we are with this as we go forward.
So let me just start off by saying this, because I think it's a very interesting process that we go through in terms of forecasting. And I always think, I used the example when we were talking about with my Department of Transportation in the Germantown area when I go home. And I'm going to go home today, and I'm going to go to Mid-Atlantic Federal Credit Union. And I'm going to exit off exit 13, and I'm going to go up Middlebrook Road, and I'm going to either make a left on Great Seneca, but if I've missed the light that has a left turn signal, then I'm going to travel up to Crystal Rock and make a left there to then turn on Wisteria and go to Mid-Atlantic Federal Credit Union. And so from a transportation planner perspective, how do they forecast where the traffic is going? Is it going down Great Seneca, or is it going down Crystal Rock? Is it going down, oh, by the way, I could also go to Middlebrook and turn on Middlebrook and then turn left on Wisteria and turn right into the Mid-Atlantic Federal Credit Union. So 3 different ways. And the reality is that as we as human beings make all those kinds of decisions every single day about so many things, quite frankly, even though they're more serious decisions about where our housing is, we go through the same sort of iterative processes. We go through the same processes when it comes to whether or not we're going to have an addition to our family. As a person who just generated a child.
It's not always iterative.
And it's not always intentional. I'm not speaking for Councilmember Tawanda.
No comment.
But it is one of those things where, again, and so it is hard, right? This isn't an easy thing, right? So no one in terms of their quest for us to be more accurate is criticizing, because this is very hard work. It really, truly is. But at the same time, what we have to do, because we know so much is at stake, is to make sure that we're as accurate as we possibly can be using all of the information provided to us so that we can get as close as we can. I think that your percent of error that you guys have historically done in other areas at 2% is quite impressive. And it's certainly something that, we'd want to be within that framework, because certainly a 2% is something that's manageable within MCPS. But I will say that the commitment that I've heard here today is what's most important to me. The commitment to make sure that we're updating, that we're being inclusive of additional information that we may have that can make our process even better, is I think what the community is asking for as well. I know that there was some pause at the beginning because it was like, well, all of this didn't have all of this information. We're using outdated information. Are we going to be held to this? But I hear today that a commitment that those numbers will be updated as a part of our full CIP that we take on this fall will certainly put a lot of people at ease when it comes to some concerns that they have. But I know that there are others that are here that you have that also, we've heard from MCCPTA, and we've seen some of the historical data inputs as well as enrollment increases from turnover of existing housing. The challenging part in that is that, the data can be the data for that year and it can completely be zero the next. I mean, turnover is not a predictable thing as well, and it's all subject to anything. Just like I said, influx of immigrants to the United States based on, no one can predict Venezuela having a crisis. No one can predict El Salvador all of a sudden tomorrow having to where the government says, you know what, we're not going to police MS-13 anymore, and what that means. We don't know those kinds of things. We don't know if the potential border wall would have an effect on immigration patterns here in the United States from Mexico. We don't know. I have no idea. I mean, you can try and project some of those things, but they all have significant impacts in terms of what happens here, right? And that's the 2%. That's that 2% margin of error. And so I really think that, again, if we can incorporate some of these things that are there, that are recommendations, to the extent possible. And that's why I always say to the extent practicable is always, because a lot of data is not useful data if it's one-offs, right? One-offs don't work. in terms of, and I'm a big numbers guy, so for me, one-offs and anomalies happen all the time, and they should not be. And the simple fact that, when we look at our financial picture, we've had an incredible stock market for 10 years now. There's a recession coming, and that's going to have a huge impact as well on people having children and on people selling their homes. So turnover will not be the same when that happens. And so there are a lot of other things that are looming in the future as well. So from that perspective, all of those, we need to try and incorporate as much as we can. Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you for that, and I really appreciate the summary of the commitment to collaboration with county agencies and communication with county agencies, and also hopefully communication with the public. I think the more we can talk about this, the more light we can shed on it. I think that will ease a lot of the concerns that are in the community. I think much of those concerns that we've talked about before, and I really appreciate the opportunity, Ms. McGuire and Dr. Zuckerman coming in and talking. And as I said there, I'll restate that, a lot of that concern, I think, is related to uncertainty, and a lot of that uncertainty is communication. And so hopefully we can help resolve that and continue to improve upon that. Did have just a quick question. Do you have any update on the BCC Walter Johnson capacity study, on what the timing of that was going to be, and plan for meetings for, how we're going to move forward?
So construction has it right in their forefront. They're going to start it this spring. We're still in spring, so it will be this spring. It will finish it up by the end of the school year, so that we have all the information that we need to provide to the superintendent as part of the review for the fall CIP process.
Okay, so be ready for the fall CIP process.
Absolutely.
Okay, and I will reiterate, I said it in the letter that I sent over, I said it again in the meeting, I've said it repeatedly, but I am very concerned with any delay, potential delay of Woodward, given the impact that it would have on a whole host of issues, not least of which is the significant school overcrowding challenges in the WJ cluster, and the tremendous amount of time, effort, and energy that you and the community have put together to get to a consensus. And I hope that we don't snatch change from the mouth of consensus with any disruption that would be significant, that would have an impact. So I just wanted to reiterate that once again, and I really do appreciate again the chair and my colleagues allowing me to sit in and join on this meeting, which was really informative and helpful. Thank you.
It's always a pleasure to have you join us in Education and Culture, Councilmember Friedson. Turn it over to you, Dr. Zuckerman, to continue through the remainder of the enrollment.
So I'm going to turn it over to
Yeah, I'll put up the new slides, so.
Yes,
why don't you do some
I'm way out of process. Good, Mr. Levchenko? Okay, usually Mr. Levchenko walks through the packet, so I think it's throwing me for a loop today.
You're giving me a chance to say to the chair that I could always use an education and some culture, so I appreciate him offering that when needed, which is normal.
I'm not going to bite on that one.
So we will be brief, but we'll give you just a quick snapshot of where we are currently with our student enrollment, and Ms. Karamijas, Director of Capital Planning, will do that.
So these are charts that you have seen over the years for new council members. These will be a little bit new. So the first one is we're looking at our official, the second column is the official 17-18 school year, the official enrollment, and then the next column, this school year, is the official September 30th, 2018-19 school year, which we are at 162,680. So that's an increase of 1134 from year over year. We talk about over the past 10 years, it has been about 2,000. So this is a smaller increase than we have seen. And what we are saying is that increase, that small increase will not last very long, because the 6-year projections indicate that we're going to go back to about 2,000 students. So you can see that annual, we've been talking a lot about historical, so this is another way to look at that historical information. We have been, again, the average has been about 2,000 students over the period from 2008, about 10 years, and we are at that last year about 1,100 students. It's just another way to look at it. We have grown over 23,000 students over that 10-year period, starting with about 140,000 in 2008 up into where we are now, that 162,680 students. And grade by grade, because we have talked about this, we talked about it, I think, last year, even the year before, where it has been, the K-5 was growing, and it was clear. We had our projects in our CIP that represented that, many additions at the elementary school level, new schools at the elementary school level. We are now seeing that increase at the secondary level. So you can see here, grades 6 through 8 is the green line, grades 9 through 12 is the red line, and K through 5 is the blue line, while you could see the K-5 is sort of flattening. You could see that just that little increase, though, because kindergartens will come back due to the birth that started back up again after the recession, so we'll be back again. And I guess you will be part of that. And so we'll mark you right there in 6 years from now. Okay.
The Albertoses are doing their best.
We will mark that. So we always want to also know the race and ethnic composition of our students. And you can see that, and Ms. Navarro talked about that, and there'll be another chart that'll even show it even more, but we are right now at 31% Hispanic, 22% African American, 14% Asian, 28% white non-Hispanic, and our two or more races is at 5%. And here's another way to look at it. Ms. Navarro referenced it. You can see the Hispanic, for example, started back in 2000, about 21,000, almost 22,000 students. We are now up to almost 51,000 students. The African American population, about 28,000 students, and climbing to about 35,000 students. That climb isn't as great as the Hispanic population, but you could also see then the inverse of the white non-Hispanic population, 65,000, almost 66,000 students, down to about 45,000 students over that same period. Free and reduced meals, Ms. Navarro also referenced this as well. We were at about 35,500 students back in 2007, and we are at about 54,410 students. I have presented these charts at a number of different groups, and what many people found striking was that top line that says 80%. So 80% of those 54,000 students that can either get free or reduced meals are actually eligible for free meals. 80% of those 54,000 students. And our ESOL population, again, growth. You could see it at the middle school and high schools, a little tapering off, and at the elementary school as well. But again, with that all changes with who's coming in and our growth, especially at the elementary school level. So the expectation is that will continue to grow as well. And I did that really quick.
Councilmember Jawando.
Yes. Could you go back to the farms,
Yep.
please? Yeah, thank you. That was great. Great snapshot. Just for the millions watching at home and that will record it later. Just explain that distinction. I think it's an important distinction for people to understand our changing population and demographics of the 80% that are eligible for free as opposed to reduced, and what the difference in income, and could you just...
So I think, and I don't know if Dr. Zuckerman knows it exactly. I know that I think it was around, for the reduced, it was around 40,000 for a family of 4. And so it would be lower than that to be eligible for the free portion.
About 30.
About 30, so it's about 30,000 for a family of 4. So
County where the median income's over 100,000.
in a count, exactly. And so that is, and like I said, from all of the presentations that I've had, that is the one that we have actually talked about the most, that 80% of those students can actually get the free meals, not the reduced, but the free. And so you're talking about a family of 4 at around $30,000.
I just think that's important to underscore as many times as we can because of the changing demographics and the need that we have for our students and the investment that is required to make sure that they have the best opportunity to succeed and are contributing to the tax base and their families down the road. I just think we just announced early child care and education investment this year and on hopefully more next year, and I just think that's really important. What's the adoption rate? I know there's always an issue of who signs up and you get a dip in high school because of so do you
So
have?
it definitely is more reflective at the elementary and the middle school than at the high school. It's just those older kids that potentially could be eligible, but for whatever reason, they don't participate. And so you definitely see more, and I have actually those breakdowns and I can share them at the elementary and middle and high school, and we do have that information.
We don't have any high schools, for example, that are Title I eligible within MCPS, as an example, because of just the threshold poverty rate at the school as determined by the farms application. So, which is there's just a drop-off in the submission at the high school level, to your point.
Well, and what have we done? We kind of say that like, well, nothing we can do about it. And what's the school system trying to do? I know it's hard because kids don't want to do it and they don't want to sign up and they have other outlets. Or how are we addressing that? Is there a plan?
We do. We
try to
do extensive outreach and we talk with families and we have historical. So it's something that we are actively working on.
Okay, well, keep me posted. That's something I know it's hard not to crack, but I just think we won because the numbers aren't right, but more importantly because there's students that need it and they're not signed up. So thank you for the presentation.
I would also just like to add, as you were talking about, Mr. Jawando, just about the investment. I know I've referenced the state and the Kerwin Commission several times, but I'm also always struck by just the percentage of our English language learners here in Montgomery County relative to the state. And we comprise about a third of the state's English language learners. And so yesterday, when we were at the Kerwin Commission, there was a delegate from another jurisdiction was talking about Montgomery County and our ability to invest locally in education. But to your point, when you have an increase in poverty coupled with a significant increase in English language learners, we actually depend on that state investment. And I'm not sure that I know everyone in the state is not aware of that. And I think that's part of the education that we have to do.
Compromise a third of the English language learners in the entire state.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think we're done with this packet. Before we move on to the next one, I'd like to actually share a bit of unfortunate news. We've actually had a Montgomery County Public Schools student, a 7th grader, who unfortunately lost her life today at Neilsville Middle School. And so I'd like to just, before we transition to the next one, just have a moment of silence for her and certainly for her family and for the Neilsville Middle School and Germantown family as a whole. All right, thank you. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our second item. Dr. Orland, you will walk us through the implications of the amended FY19 to 24 Capital Improvements Program for the SSP, our Subdivision Staging Policy Public School Adequacy Test. And so, Dr. Orland, I'll just turn it over to you to kind of walk us through.
Thank you. And I'm joined by James Sartori with the planning staff who does the, Jason Sartori, can I always do that? Jason Sartori is with the school planning analyst for park and planning. Yeah, why don't you, from now on, it's you, okay? And also to alert everybody, we have to finish this meeting at 4:30 because the members of the board and probably several members of the audience need to go over back to the Carver Center. The board's meeting at 5 o'clock to discuss the Northwood-Woodward issue, which we're going to be talking about in a few minutes. So, with that, okay, the subdivision staging policy, the school test, as you probably know, it requires that there be, if enrollment 5 years from now is more than 20% over capacity at any level within the cluster, then the entire cluster goes into moratorium for subdivision approvals. Furthermore, if a middle school service area has more than 120% capacity 5 years from enrollment over capacity 5 years from now, and is a deficit of 180 students, then that service area is in moratorium. And for an elementary school, it's 20% over capacity and 110 student deficit goes to moratorium. As you know, also, we've been programming some what we call solution projects or placeholder projects for nearly a decade now. In those situations where there's really four things that happen. One is a cluster or a school service area is projected to go over 20%. Secondly, if there is in fact potential housing development applications which look like they will come to fruition over the course of the next fiscal year. Thirdly, if MCPS is right now or is about to start active planning for an addition or a new school or some kind of additional capacity that would serve that area. And fourthly, that the production schedule for such a school is such that you could perceive it being open within 5 years. So for example, if it's a high school that's being studied, it's not likely it's going to be done within 5 years, so you wouldn't be able to count that. The most recent application of the school test was in July of, late June, July of this past year, 2018. That's when it's always done. It's based on the CIP approved prior to that, as well as the enrollment forecasts that are in effect then. And as a result, 2 clusters were in moratorium, Montgomery, Blair, and Northwood, and 5 elementary school service areas, Ashburton, Burnt Mills, Highland View, Lake Seneca, and Stonegate. Highland View actually was going to be in moratorium anyway because it's part of Northwood, but that service area also failed the test. Park and Planning has projected, as well as schools, the effect of what the FY20 school test, the one this summer, would look like, and that's on Circle 1. And it shows a host of areas that could go in moratorium without some kind of other action. So you see that for on Circle 1, there are 6 high schools which will go into moratorium, or 5 actually, that have to do with high school inadequacy, and 1 having to do with elementary school, which is the Blake cluster, because the total elementary school space will not be sufficient. And so we're going through each of these individually. First of all, at Rich, Montgomery, and Quince Orchard clusters, the council programmed nearly $126 million for a new house school on the Crown Farm last year. And the project schedule has it such that most of the money is going to be spent in FY20, I'm going to find it right here, so I'll make sure I get this right, FY23 and 24, with a little bit of money, $10 million in FY25. That's a typical pattern for a school that's going to open by September 2024. Now, the Board of Education hasn't said they're going to open it by then yet, but I think the council can very safely assume that it will. And so what you could do is add language on the PDF for Crown, which means amending the Crown PDF, to say as follows, top of page 3. Based on the Board of Education's proposed yearly expending for the project, and this is their proposal, the council anticipates that Crown High School will be open in September 2024. The new school will relieve overcrowding by at least 150 students at Quince Orchard and at least 120 students at Richard Montgomery. The school is going to have 2,700 students in it. It's going to relieve 5 existing high schools, 2 of which are these 2, and the absolute minimum that would be provided in the way of relief, in fact, it's likely to be much more, would be 150 at Quince Orchard and 120 at Richard Montgomery. So if you do that, then Park and Planning will be able to, this summer, when they look at the CIP that's approved, say, okay, we can count those students as being no longer attending those 2 schools respectively by September 2024, and both of those areas will not be in moratorium. Then the next set of projects is the interesting one. This is what the 5 o'clock meeting is going to be about, which is involving Northwood, Einstein, Blair, and Walter Johnson, and it centers around the schedule for Northwood and Woodward. Last year at just about this time, Dr. Smith was here at an education committee meeting, and he was asked about Woodward at that time, as is now, was programmed to be essentially totally rebuilt as a 2,700 student high school. And the question was how many of those students, how many students from Walter Johnson could be relieved by that school? Now, the idea for Woodward at the time was to build out much of it, in fact, most of it, well before September 2023, actually, at that point. And Dr. Smith said that you could count upon, the plan then was that 400 students at least from Walter Johnson could attend that new school when it opened. And based on that finding, we found that Walter Johnson was not going to be in moratorium as a cluster as a whole, and so it didn't go into moratorium, so it's not in moratorium right now. However, as you know, the school system's done a lot of work in the last year trying to figure out exactly how to do both Northwood and Woodward. And this subject of this meeting is 5 o'clock. One proposal that's on the table is to work on Woodward first, to open an interim version of it by, I believe it's, what did we say, September of 2023, thank you. And that would be sufficiently large to house all the Northwood students and then some. But the idea is certainly that in the scenario that Northwood students would move into this new school. And then once that happens, the work at Northwood would start. And then work at Woodward can also continue at that point, but it would be different parts of the campus, and so it really wouldn't interrupt the students' activities at that school. As it appears right now, it looks like that both Woodward and the final Woodward and the final Northwood would be finished under that scenario by September 2025. So it's a year beyond what could be countable in the SSP this fall, this summer. The board has asked the MCPS to look at several options that would house Northwood at a different location and to see what the availability of other spaces are and what the costs would be involved with that. And that's, I think, the subject of this presentation at 5 o'clock. It's fair to assume that any other option is going to cost a lot more money because if you're going to fit out a new building or even take over another building, you either have to buy it or lease it or and fit it out. So we think the board's going to make a decision, final decision on this, not today, but it'll be in a few weeks, maybe the end of March. And at that point, we'll know exactly where everything sort of falls into place. But the one scenario that we know about for sure is the one I just described. If that happens, then what I would say is the following. One, you can make the argument, and it's really your decision, it's not the board's, that Northwood not be in moratorium, because even though Northwood is not going to be at Northwood, it's going to be, all the students will be in a new school. It's going to be at Woodward for a couple of years, but it'll be in a new school. So you could say, I think with clarity, that Northwood should not be in moratorium. However, because the Northwood kids wouldn't be moving out until September, and the new students would be moving in until September 2025, it would mean that Walter Johnson couldn't move in, which means that Walter Johnson will be in moratorium starting this coming July for a year. It means that Montgomery Blair, which is in moratorium this year, would stay in moratorium for one more year. And then finally, Einstein. Einstein has been out of moratorium for the last couple of years because there's been a solutions project for it. And that was based on the thought that at the time, for a number of years, the idea was that there would be an addition at Einstein. What's clear now that all the scenarios the board's looking at does not take that into account. The idea is that when Northwood and Woodward are done, that's the location for the Einstein overage, if you will. Overage, probably bad term. Einstein will be relieved by one or both of those schools. So the Einstein, what I would say is the Einstein Cluster High School Solution Project, which actually is in the board's request, should come out. And that Einstein would go in moratorium also again for 1 year. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there is space in Woodward to be able to accommodate at least 300 kids from Walter Johnson. But that would mean that there would be a pretty complicated set of decisions the board would have to make, and if they really want to make that, to figure out, well, which students go, what class goes, what part of what class goes, what does that mean in terms of which schools feed into what. We're talking about a 2-year period, so it's not just one set of students 1 year, it's another set of students the next year before Woodward becomes open for a full boundary change. Quite complicated. So I think the safer bet now is that's not going to happen. So the only recommendation I have out of this is that tomorrow I have to put out a packet which will have CIP amendments to be introduced or announced next Tuesday for the public hearings when you have the operating budget. And I would, unless you say no, I think what we do is we put in an amendment for Einstein, which would basically say take it out. take out the cluster project. Same is true with Crown in terms of amending it to include the language that I mentioned at the top of page 3.
Dr. Orton, let me just stop there because we've gone through two very big decision points, I think, and just allow the school system to weigh in terms of their reaction to what they've heard from you in terms of your recommendations. So, Dr. Zuckerman.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. This has been a really challenging process for the last couple of years, just around on the school's end, navigating the need for facility and even just as you heard Mr. Schmidt from MGT talk about useful tools for capital planning for educational purposes, and at the same time addressing development issues, which we understand that our data and our decision-making were a part of, but ultimately, obviously, our core mission is focused on having the right schools for students. So we've taken a view on this that there's probably some different ways to think about just in general, just how development intersects. So, for example, particularly where we are right now with respect to our capital planning and the infill development and just development in general being so dynamic, things are going to change. What we know is whatever decision the board is going to make, whether Woodward will be used as a holding center or not, the seats are available in the Walter Johnson cluster or will be available for students. I was in Prince George's County for a number of years, and we had a holding center that was supposed to be used for a school, but another school was impacted by an earthquake. We had the earthquake, I don't know if you remember back, I believe it was 2009. And we had to scrap all the plans and send the students to that holding school, completely upended the capital program and probably had an impact on development. So I've been thinking about this and thinking to myself, what would happen if the board decided to construct construct Northwood and have students in a holding center that's not Woodward, and then something were to happen next year that would, all of a sudden Woodward would have to be in play because of an emergency. But we would approve, that would allow the council to approve development. So I just think the point I'm trying to make is the space is going to be there for school infrastructure and in a lot of parts of the county, and if with more funding, we'll have even more space. So from our perspective, we just think there's a lot of options here for you to consider, recognizing the challenges that Dr. Orland presented and that we're all up against. There's room here to be creative and think a little bit differently, because we have to think differently right now as well, just around how we're planning for the future and doing all of these high school projects. So it's just, it's a really challenging time. And some board members foresaw this several years ago as we were thinking about the SSP and just sort of being on a little bit of a collision course with moratorium and school development and it catching up to us. So we're happy to help and be as thoughtful and collaborative as we can through this. We want to figure this out with you and with everyone.
All I'd say is we need to figure this out soon.
Right.
It has to be done as part of the CIP, and it has to be something that's real. I mean, it has to be based on an affirmative decision by the Board of Education if they feel it's in the best interest of the students to be able to do this kind of thing, and it would have to actually be on the project description form. And actually have to say how many students would be relieved at that school by thus and such date. Otherwise, Jason cannot count that in his staff report to the planning board, and the area will go in a moratorium.
So let me ask you this. Is there an objection to the Einstein Cluster High School Solution Project being removed? Because I think that's one of our major...
There's no objection.
Okay, so that's a piece that I think wanted to be clear, and also when it comes to the Crown and having the additional language that's there regarding 150 students, Quince Orchard, 120 students at Richard Montgomery High School, is there a concern when it comes to the Crown High School? I mean, obviously, it's going to be well more than that.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I think actually very much in line with what I'm saying, which is we know what we're planning for, and you're right, it will very likely be more.
Right. So let me turn to Councilmember Duwando.
You want to move on those?
Well, yeah,
You want to go through the rest of them, or
I'd rather do these two and knock them out, and then we'll come back to that, because I think that, again, what I might be hearing from you, Dr. Zuckerman, is some sort of language that's similar to what we just did with Crown, to where we would say that I'm not sure, Dr. Orland, if we want to get that wordsmithy with saying either of the two projects will alleviate congestion at XYZ schools, which therefore would then, remove
need
X
some-
number of students.
Sorry, we would need something, that we need a decision by the Board of Education.
Right.
To say that this will relieve X number of students for Walter Johnson, with the idea that that's going to happen. And that's what we based it on last year with Dr. Smith's statement about the 400 students, that things have changed. And so I think the board needs to go through this meeting today and make their decision in a couple of weeks. And I'm sure this is all in the back of their minds anyway, but it really starts with the board.
Ms. McGuire?
I just want to be sure that I clarify what the pieces are. So understanding that there would need to be some commitment about how many students from Walter Johnson would be relieved, I think that's a discussion that would be able to have. My understanding is there was also an issue about the completion date of when the school would be occupied by those students. Is that part of the issue?
The idea is that, but we'd have to say, the wording would have to be something like, by no later than September 2024, the interim Woodward facility would be able to relieve Walter Johnson High School by at least 300 students. Now, I don't see how you can say that without actually having a plan actually how that's going to happen. So, just saying it and then.
Well, and I'm sorry, that is why I wanted to clarify the timing issue, because if we're just talking about numbers, that's one thing, but clearly the time and the schedule is sort of the more, that is, as we've been saying, that is going to be the subject of this evening's discussion and the board's future action around what sequencing is feasible there.
So if you could communicate that to council staff and to the committee, that will then help us. So Glenn, I hate to do this to you, but we'll stick a pin in this one until they've had their meeting tonight. In fairness, certainly having the board have a chance to have their meeting and talk with the community, I think is best to be able to come up with what those.
There was no decision I was going to ask you about Blair or Northwood. It was
okay.
strictly Einstein.
Right. Oh, okay. All right. Well, then we're good there. All right. Okay. I'm sorry, Councilmember Jawando. Yeah. Yep.
I just wanted to follow up. Thank you for the clarification with MCPS on, and Dr. Zuckerberg in particular, on the creative ideas. So can you give me a preview of, what you mean by that? And I know you're going to have further discussions, but can you give me an example?
So it was very unusual, for example, for us last year to have in a plan, and then as things evolve and change, we adapted and we had to plan differently. And so my point to just the council is very simply that there is, if you want, this is not my decision. Our decision, right, is about whether or not where our kids are going to go, and do we have a capital plan for the long term for our high school students. The challenge that you have, and we as a community have, is just that it doesn't fall within. We don't know if we can relieve. We'll know in a few weeks whether or not we can relieve that overcrowding at Walter Johnson within the 6 years. I'm sorry, 5 years. Thank you.
And please feel free to. My point was the creative options on your side are appreciated.
They're not creative on our side.
Okay, you're kicking it over here. Okay, that's what I was trying to elicit. Okay.
School system inspires creativity.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. But that's for you to decide. The last thing I'll say is when we look at the subdivision staging policy and the intent and spirit of it, it is to make sure that there's adequate infrastructure for this county. And from our perspective, and there's disagreement, and that I understand that. From our perspective, there is going to be adequate infrastructure for our high school students at Northwood and Walter Johnson and Woodward.
Even if it technically is a year, give or take a year on the,
Yep.
okay, that's helpful. And I'm sorry, I think I said Zuckerberg, it's obviously Zuckerman.
Okay, I hear it a lot, and
As someone who gets their name messed up a lot, I want to acknowledge that on the record, so I'm sorry, Andy. Yeah, thank you.
had his big.
Dr. Worley, we can go ahead to Blake Cluster.
Sure. Blake, as I mentioned earlier, is forecast to actually have a shortage of elementary school space across the entire cluster. There's actually two schools that are, for which the board is going to be, this MCPS is going to be initiating architectural design in FY20 at Burnt Mills and in Stonegate. And those two schools are also two of the 9 schools which are included under the, right now, the umbrella placeholder project, major capital projects, which is near $120 million. But as the school system has mentioned to me several times, unless the board were to want to separate out one of these schools right now and say, okay, we're just going to do Burnt Mills, and then the rest of it will be the rest of the other 8, then Blake could come out of moratorium, or not go into moratorium at all. But they're not prepared to do that yet. They are looking at all these schools, and they're looking at how to do each of them. So we can't really do a solutions project for it because there's money there to actually build a project potentially. So we're in this sort of in-between world. The point I was going to make, though, is that makes the most important is that Jason has done some research and found that in the Blake Cluster service area, if you will, because it's part of the Northeast Consortium, there really isn't any impending housing that's happening in the next year. So yes, we go into moratorium, but probably no harm to anybody who wants to develop. So there, I think that's just what's going to happen. But by next year, my understanding from talking to staff is that MCPS staff is that in the next CIP, the board will be developing discrete projects out of the major capital program. And so if Burnt Mills is one of them, then fine. That'll be the following year, the area will come out of moratorium, or Stonegate, or who knows what else. But those two are the ones that they're beginning to work on now.
Let me just jump in there very quickly, because we are talking about, and I want to clarify for folks that are in the audience and at home, that while we are talking about moratorium, and that is the subject of our discussion, the driving factor is the capacity that we have in our schools, and that some of our schools are overcrowded, and that we're not understanding that that is a huge concern, that this is not just about building and allowing folks to develop, but this is also about understanding that we have schools that are over capacity and need to address that issue. The underlying result of that may be that development cannot continue any longer, but at the forefront, and Dr. Zuckerman, you said this very well, but I want to reiterate, is that we need to make sure that we have space that's adequate for our children to learn and is conducive for that, that's not in a burgeoning of the seams kind of situation. And so certainly from a moratorium standpoint, it gets to that particular level of really to where it is the maximum capacity that you could have. And that's why we halt development, because we say we don't want to contribute any more to something that is a serious problem. And so I just want to make sure that our community understands that while we are talking about the moratorium aspects, this is also about understanding that we're in a very difficult place when it comes to finding space for all of our children inside of our schools. So just wanted to put that out there.
In terms of individual school service areas, middle of page 4, I note that Francis Scott Key Middle School is the only middle school service area projected to exceed the moratorium threshold. And when planning staff looked at that area, they initially thought, well, there's really nothing coming. But then Eileen Finnegan, who I know you're watching, wrote us literally an hour before the meeting started today, that there is a multifamily project moving forward in Hillendale, which is in the Key service area. It's going to have 455 to 500 apartments. 155 of them will be age restricted, but that still means that 300 to 350 or so are units that would be generating kids. And that's not likely to come before the planning board for action before the end of this fiscal year. It'll probably come next year. So based on that, I'm going to ask MCPS staff immediately to get us information as to what a solutions project would be for Key, because otherwise the Key service area will go in moratorium. And the MCPS is starting planning on Key, so it's totally legitimate in that respect. It's not something that they hadn't looked forward to working on. There are several other solution projects in the CIP currently. Bethesda and Somerset are both serving the Bethesda CBD area. That's a very hot area right now. As you know, Bethesda Elementary School serves about 3/4 of the CBD, and Somerset the southernmost quarter of it. And so I'm not recommending that we take those solution projects out. And you heard earlier, based on Mr. Friedson's question, that school system staff is going to be finishing up with their study this fiscal year or this summer perhaps. And so the board will be in a position to recommend a project that will relieve both Somerset and Bethesda Elementary, as well as other schools in the cluster and the WJ cluster in the next CIP. And if that happens, and particularly if that happens with projects starting for design in FY21, then there will be capacity serving those, relieving those schools then. Whether it's in the BCC cluster or in the WJ cluster or what it is, we don't know yet. Well, we're all waiting to hear, but that's there. On the other hand, we also did a solutions project for Resnick Elementary School in the Magruder cluster, and that's an area where there's very little development. In fact, there's no development pending at all. There's not a lot of movement in terms of planning for at MCPS on Resnick beyond what they're doing now, which is to finishing up an addition. So that's another one that I recommend that we delete from the CIP. There's only a few $1 million in that, but there's no reason to hold on to that if there's really nothing happening. So that's the recommendation.
So, Dr. Zuckerman, would you care to comment on the Resnick Elementary School solution project and whether or not you would object to that being?
That's fine.
Okay. All right. Councilmember Jawando? All right. So without
The
objection.
last thing I want to mention, well, a couple last things, two last things. One is that Burning Tree Elementary School in the Whitman cluster is projected to go in moratorium in FY20, and there is a 16-unit development scheduled before the planning board for approval sometime this spring. Now, if it does get approved this spring, it gets in under the wire, if you will. But if for some reason that it does delay beyond July 1st, then the area will be in moratorium and it will not move. The board is not planning any kind of, doing any planning towards an addition or anything that would resolve overcrowding at Burning Tree, so that is what would happen. But I think it's a good chance that project will probably be approved before July 1st anyway. And there are several other elementary school service areas which will go into moratorium. I listed there at the bottom of page 4. And our initial thought was that none of them really are going to have any development activities, so again, no harm, no foul. Except, of course, about an hour and a half ago, got a letter from Saul Centers talking about development in Rockville that they think is coming in the farmland service area. And now farmland is one that is in the WJ cluster, but it overlaps, part of it's in the city and part of it's in the county, outside the city. In the county part of it, we think there's really nothing happening. But in the city, it's sort of this general language here about we don't want to see farmland go into moratorium because their development will be happening eventually. And Linda Moran, who's here with the city of Rockville, is going to check on that now. Oh, you've already checked. Have you found it? Oh.
Linda, why don't you come
This
on
is
up?
in time, real time, no, I don't remember oh, here it is. Let's see what you said. Hasn't that happened before?
Please go ahead and introduce yourself, Linda.
Good afternoon, Chair Rice and members of the committee. I'm Linda Moran, Assistant to the City Manager at the City of Rockville. And I have an email here from our Chief of Planning, Jim Wasilak, and I'd like to read that to you. It says, there are no pending projects in the farmland service area other than Twin Brook Quarter, which is partially in the RM cluster. So I sent that email to you,
I got
Glenn.
it. I see it right now. I guess the question is partially in the RM cluster, is it partly in the WJ cluster
Yes,
within
it's
farmland?
partially in both.
Well, that might make a difference then, because again, if it's in the farmland elementary school cluster service area and the area goes into moratorium, and if the city's continuing to follow the county's test, then it wouldn't be approvable.
Right. And Adrian?
Yeah, if I can just clarify too, so the capacity study that we talked about, remember, is a joint capacity study between Walter Johnson and BCC. So whatever you would be doing for BCC at the elementary school level, you potentially could do the same thing for the WJ cluster as well.
No, I understand that. The question really is, though, we don't want to use up, valuable CIP space if it's really not going to, make a difference in terms of keeping an area out of more.
If there was no development.
If there's no development, that was my point. And so, let me follow up with Linda again, but I guess what I'd say is that if it does look like it would stop that, then the question for you is, do you want to put a solutions project for farmland? At least, you don't have to agree to do it now, just be putting it on the agenda for consideration later in the spring. And, if we find out that, oh, well, never mind, we don't need it, you don't have to approve it. But it looks like to me we probably would need to do this, at least for now.
Okay, well, I think we need to get more information, and then we'll certainly come back to that one and figure out what we may need to do. We'll also be in contact with planning to figure out a real timeline of when approvals may be able to take place as we're approaching a full year CIP. So, Dr. Zuckerman?
So this conversation is one that we've had a lot internally, and I think it highlights the competing pressures that we're facing, both in MCPS and also at the county. So our CIP, as you know, is focused on a few key areas. One is to address growth. The other is to address aging infrastructure, and more our CIP hearings over the last several years have been focused on aging infrastructure, HVAC systems that are starting to fail to the point that they need replacement, roof repairs, ADA accessibility issues, a variety of systemic infrastructure needs that necessarily will be crowded out when we add capacity projects. And when you see the growth that Adrian presented earlier in the 20,000 student increase, we've focused so much for a number of years now on growth at the expense, I would argue, of aging infrastructure. And so it's just a challenge in terms of sequencing priorities. And we're trying to position the CIP to better address aging infrastructure, which then takes away from capacity. So these are just the challenges that we all face. I know you know this, but I did just want to point out that when we put placeholder and solution projects in, it's going to crowd out those other funds, and it's just going to require a lot of intentional planning going forward.
Let me just say that that's one of the reasons why, and we continue to have this conversation about how Montgomery County basically is building on the backs of their own taxpayers and don't have the support of the state. It's why we're hopeful that the state, in ponying up, because we've had to pick and choose. We as a jurisdiction have had to pick and choose between capacity and aging infrastructure, when in fact, if we had actually received the amount of money we should from the state, we would have been able to do both. We would have been able to continue to have economic development that helps contribute to Montgomery County's economic engine, but the state's economic engine, but also address some of the infrastructure needs that we continue to see happening in our communities. And so, from that perspective, it's my hope that with the 3 bills that are proposed in Annapolis, primarily dealing with school construction dollars, we may see some additional funds come from Annapolis finally that will certainly help us on that front. But certainly we understand completely the challenges that MCPS faces, the challenges that we continue to face when it comes to government buildings as we continue to expand in areas and are talking about giving infrastructure to areas like Clarksburg while still ensuring that aging infrastructure in places like East County happen. It's the exact same thing, whether it's with our schools or whether it's with our roads, transportation, all of those things, it's the exact same conversation that the difficulty that you're experiencing, that we experience on a multitude of levels. Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your advocacy in Kerwin and in Annapolis. I know many of us took a bus ride up with a lot of teachers to advocate for our fair share, and earlier this week, and I couldn't agree more that it's about time. With the demographic data we've seen, the growth, the need, I'm in East County, I see it every day, and Down County certainly sees it, and so we need to balance it. The question I had on that, does your CIP, and I think I know the answer to this, but I would like you to confirm it for me, since we're going to see that smaller bit of projected enrollment, are you reprioritizing or bumping up the kind of maintenance or infrastructure in that one year? Is there any adjustments that you've made in light of that? I know it's going to come back and be back at the 2,000 number, but I'm just curious, have you factored that in at all?
So I think that while there is sort of that slight downturn in the increase, again, we do expect it to come back, and we're still building for the capacity and overutilization that we do have already, that already exists. And so unfortunately, there's not that opportunity at this point.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you.
Councilmember Reamer.
Thanks. Just in the genre of no easy answers, the property that the developers that want to do the mall, the Westfield Mall, they want to go forward, and they're caught up in this Walter Johnson moratorium, and they've calculated that they would provide almost, I think it's about $7 million in impact taxes from the one or two buildings that they would want to put up. And I wonder what the relative value is to us of $7 million that we can immediately put towards whether it's capacity projects or modernization projects versus the incremental student addition that will come out of that building. It's a very tough balance. So in any event, I think we've got to figure out how to solve this problem this year. I don't know yet what the answers are. I hope there is a good way that actually you devise that works, on this suggestion of potentially students going at the Woodward site, but we'll hear what you have to say. But I think that we're working against ourselves in so many different ways here. It's just, it's a tough spot, no matter how you look at it.
All right, well, I think that we've got our decision points for today. We have more that we need to discuss. Good luck for your meeting this evening. It's just been a crazy day within MCPS. I just heard that we also had a school bus accident where there were some injuries. Fortunately, no fatalities, but injuries as well, again, in the Germantown area. So I'm headed to Germantown, but minor injuries, thank you. Yeah, so, but we are adjourned. Thank you so much, guys.